Shashi, can I turn to you to address initially that particular concept, freedoms of speech?
Of speech. Well, I think that's probably where I'll start disagreeing with Christopher. I mean, I'm not an absolutist about that or anything else, largely because, though I believe passionately in freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and have chosen to exercise it in my writings, I think I do believe very much that this has to be upheld and protected. I tend, from where I sit, to see the case for responsibility as well, and that is for taking into account that freedom of speech has consequences that the speaker ought to bear in mind. And since Cristopher came up with an American example, I think it's also worthwhile quoting the American Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that freedom of speech does not extend to the right to shout fire falsely in a crowded theatre. In other words, when your freedom of speech causes other people harm, you do have to think twice about whether you can exercise it. And I suppose at some point the authorities have the responsibility to ensure that freedom is exercised reasonably. But when Cristopher comes up with the question of the community, that's when we get into a different sort of problem, because there, it's, as he said, it's not so much about whether the state is trying to abridge your freedoms of speech. It's whether you say or write or paint or do other things which cause such grievous offense to a section of people in the society in which you live that the societal well-being is jeopardized. We were talking before coming in, I told you this anecdote, a true one, about 10 years ago from India, when a Bangalore newspaper in its Sunday magazine section published a short story called Muhammad the Idiot, which was about a retarded boy called Muhammad. And of course, the title was enough to inflame a mob of very, very angry people who stormed the newspaper, trashed the offices, broke up the press. And I have to tell you that very many fans of Indian democracy and freedom of speech didn't actually have much sympathy for the newspaper. It was they really ought to have known better, was the attitude. And indeed, the newspaper abjectly apologized the next day. And I believe the author of that headline has not worked in the paper since. So the problem here is, I'm afraid, one of what do you think in your society, in the social circumstances in which you're functioning, you can reasonably do without provoking a serious law and order problem.
So that case would be, when Christopher, you can come in a moment, the issue there is one of bad editing, because the art...
It may have been the author's original title, I have no idea.
No, but I mean, should it not have been noted by the editor, publisher, etc., at that point, that the very phrase itself, which was not intrinsic to the story, was going to be problematic?
Incendiary, yes. It should have been. You know, it's easy enough to say that if something provokes a mob to violence, it's the mob that ought to be punished or prosecuted for violating the law and being violent. But then you get into the whole question of whether a certain offense was so grievous as to serve as a sort of extenuation for the outrage expressed by the mob. We've seen this in the satanic verses debate too.
Christopher?
Fire. Fire.
Well, you know he's saying it falsely, don't you?
No, well, two points about that. One is,
the only fire is at the
how
tip
do
of
you
your
know
cigarette.
how you could be just as liable to start a panic if there was a fire by shouting fire as you could, in fact more likely than you would be liable to start a panic if there was not, as I think I've just demonstrated. Justice Holmes's famous judgment, it seems to me, is one of the stupidest remarks ever made from the bench of the United States Supreme Court. And by the way, he made it in the following context. A group of Yiddish-speaking socialists who were opposed to Mr. Wilson's First World War, America's participation in the imperial bloodbath, gave out leaflets in Yiddish in New York saying, don't sign up for the war, don't believe in it, you're being led into a disaster. They were put in prison for life for producing leaflets in Yiddish, making a socialist case against the war. And the bloody fool Oliver Wendell Holmes had the nerve to say it was the equivalent of shouting fire in a crowded theatre where there was no fire. Of course there was fire. There was a bloodbath on the Western Front. That's a fire enough for anybody. So, you shouldn't have used such a bullshit example.
Oh, all right.
Right, okay.
So let me rephrase it. Your right to wave your fist stops just short of my face. How about that?
Well, the second thing is, as Mr. Lincoln once said, just as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. I don't claim the right not to be censored, I claim the right not to be a censor. I insist on this. the beliefs of the religious are very offensive to me. When I have to read in the newspapers that if I don't accept a bogus story about a supposed human sacrifice that took place in Jerusalem in something like AD 1933, if I don't accept this, I'm going to hell. If I don't accept this wonderful offer, I'm extremely offended. I think of all the cruelty and violence and misery and stupidity that's been inflicted by that. I do not go and burn down the nearest Baptist or Catholic church. I'd be ashamed of myself if I did. I don't call for people to form mobs to vindicate my hurt feelings. I don't do it. The Archangel Gabriel never said a word to the peasant Muhammad. Not a word. The event, as described, did not take place. I feel quite certain in saying so. Any more than the Archangel Gabriel announced himself to the non-Virgin Mary. I find it repellent to have to hear of people and the way they're treated who live under systems where that stuff is believed. It couldn't be more offensive to me. Who's ever going to say, well, if your feelings are hurt, Christopher, you're perfectly entitled to go burn down a newspaper or a house of worship? Right. How contemptible can you possibly get? Picture, if you will, suppose you are a sensitive person wishing to live in a multicultural universe. And you think, well, I'll go out of my way if I have to. I'll bend over backwards not to do anything that will needlessly inflame a Muslim person. Suppose that was your wish, your desire. How could you possibly have known, if you'd made that resolution, that some caricatures, actually, published in an afternoon paper in Copenhagen, would lead to an international pogrom against a small Northern European democracy, with its diplomatic immunity violated, its embassies burned, the embassies of a democracy burned, I mean to say, by mobs in the capital cities of dictatorships like Libya and Syria, where demonstrations are not normally allowed, where suddenly the police don't show up, where people who look Scandinavian are attacked, where anyone who is Scandinavian is condemned and subjected to a boycott, a racist boycott, in fact, from Pakistan to Indonesia, where violence and intimidation are used against the press, where embassies of supposedly Muslim countries call upon the Prime Minister of Denmark to tell him what he's not legally allowed to do, that he must censor his own press, which is not in his ability to do. And where threats, in other words, are brought by the heads of states who claim to speak for Islam. Now, I don't know any Muslim who thinks that the ambassador of Egypt or Libya or Algeria speaks for Islam. There's no reason to think that these ramshackle dictatorships have any such right. The Prime Minister of Denmark certainly has no right to intervene in what is published in the press in Denmark. It's one of the most extraordinary cases of intimidation, and this against a country that devotes a sizable part of its budget to helping the Palestinian Authority, to sending peacekeepers and humanitarian workers to the Arab world, that had done its best to accommodate Muslim immigrants, that doesn't have an imperial past, that didn't invade Vietnam or bomb Hiroshima or any of the usual crap that you hear. No, it means that if whatever you do, they will find a reason to take offense. And when they've done that, they think it's their axiomatic right to go straight to violence of the most criminal kind, including, you represent the United Nations here, Shashi, for heaven's sake, violations of diplomatic immunity, one of the most precious gains of human civilization. No, one has to oppose this 100%. It is intolerable, insufferable. It's enough concessions already that have been made. Has to stop now.
Nothing can justify or condone the behavior, the violations of diplomatic immunity, indeed, the colossal destruction to people and property that followed. But there is very little doubt in my mind that the entire exercise was designed to inflame. The editors actually sought caricatures of Muhammad. They wrote to the Danish Cartoonists Association. A majority of the cartoonists turned down their invitation to do caricatures of Muhammad. And one of the 12 who responded did so by drawing a cartoon, not of Muhammad the Prophet, but of a named schoolboy in a Danish school called Muhammad, who wrote on a blackboard, this is the caricature, wrote on a blackboard, the editors of this paper are reactionary provocateurs. That was one of the 12 cartoons actually said that.
Not bad.
And when they published it, the editors added their own notes to this cartoon, saying this cartoonist is a coward who does not understand the menace posed to our society by Muslim fundamentalism. Where's that effect on the cartoon? So, in other words, they knew perfectly well what they were doing. Now, as I said, that doesn't excuse the misbehavior of those who attacked people and property and all of that. But it does say that when you know you're going to create offense, you have to ask yourself why you're doing this. Perhaps you couldn't have predicted every single one, every single detail of the consequences, but that there would be consequences, I think there could have been no doubt about. I mean, Christopher and I are both friends of Salman Rushdie, and we certainly know that, that what he went through, no one should have to go through, and of course, one of his translators was killed and all of that. But the fact that Muslims took as much offense as they did to the depictions of a fictionalized version of the Prophet in this novel, a novel which in many other ways, and perhaps not to Christopher's taste, is actually an amazing affirmation of mystical belief towards the end of the novel. If such a novel could cause that kind of offense and lead to the consequences it did, it's extremely difficult to believe the editors of this newspaper didn't have an inkling of what they were stirring up. And this is a newspaper, by the way, which had a record in the 1930s of publishing anti-Semitic articles. I mean, they have most of their circulation over the years.
Right to publish anti-Semitic articles and publish anti-Christian cartoons. What was said about the Danish cartoons is exactly what was said about Salman when he published the novel. You must remember. People said, aha, darkly, they'd say, he knew what he was doing. Hugh Trevor Roper said he should be beaten up and kicked around in the street by Pakistani gangs because he hoped to bring on a response. Well, of course he wrote a novel using Holy Writ for literary purposes, knowing that that might upset some people. He thought it was about time to open this discussion in the Muslim world, and many Muslim intellectuals sided with him. But straight away, the immediate resort to violence and intimidation, not just the threat of murder, but murder itself. It doesn't matter to me if these people believe this, if they say, for example, we don't represent our prophet in figure, or indeed almost the human figure itself in figure, because we fear idolatry. That's good. It's much better than having pictures of weeping virgins or statues of them that may be led to weep if you can put enough pig's blood on it and put a candle nearby. The endless fraudulence of Christianity. Fine. That's their belief. But they can't tell me I can't talk about the Prophet Muhammad. They absolutely cannot do that.
Part of the problem, I think, in our world is our failure sometimes to realize that other people aren't necessarily like us. In other words, that there are societies in different stages of cultural consciousness or sophistication. Not everyone is a Christopher Hitchens. And if there are people in sufficient number who are literalist in their beliefs and therefore will feel grievously wounded, I mean, if for them an offense to the Virgin Mary, or more likely an offense to the Prophet Muhammad, is equivalent to a sexual assault on their mother or their sister or their wife or whatever, and they react accordingly, I'm afraid to some degree they are to be pitied, because that's a level of reaction that you would not be capable of. But since they do react that way, should we not, as people producing that which is going to cause this reaction, be conscious that it might?
Right,
I mean, on the Satanic Verses, I remember at the time an argument with an Indian Muslim who was a government official, but not at that point involved in any of the decisions on the book, so he was speaking not for the government, but in a social conversation, who when I said, this is outrageous, and how can you ban this book? The people who are clamoring for it to be banned haven't read it. And he said, that's beside the point. It doesn't matter that they haven't read it. It's enough that enough of their leaders are saying that this is what the book does, that it creates a law and order problem, and the duty of the government is to ensure that it maintains law and order in these communities. And that was the argument that he was making, and it's one which I, on that particular instance, found very difficult to accept. But I can see how in certain circumstances, a government or an editor or somebody else in a position of decision-making will have to weigh in the balance the right to publish a particular cartoon, to publish a particular short story or a novel, versus the potential loss of life and destruction of property to large numbers of people. Now, there is no one rule for around the world.
Well,
so you might say that you can't publish this in this country, but you can in that one, because in that country people will not be offended.
You can't say that anymore.
But then, my dear Shashi, you should be very happy because everyone is weighing it. There wasn't a single newspaper in Britain that published those cartoons. There wasn't a single one, there was one magazine in America either. I know the people in charge of these matters in many cases. I went on CNN to debate some spokesman for a Muslim organization, and CNN put up the cartoons, the page of Denmark, pixelated. And I said to the interviewer, you're not doing this because you're afraid of upsetting my Muslim fellow guest, are you? You're doing it because you're afraid that you'll be burned out if you do, your bureaus will. She said, yes, that's right.
Is that not a legitimate fear?
It's a very legitimate fear. If you allow the right of Muslims to use violence against anything they don't like, of course it's a legitimate fear. It's certainly, if it's not legitimate, it's a real one. But it seems to me amazing that my profession should give up without a fight on this point. So you should be happy, and they're all doing it. PBS, the public station, decided they could do it this way, and it's significant. They said, we can show the cartoons in this manner. We can show them the imams of Denmark traveling around showing the cartoons to others. We can film them doing that, and by accident, the cartoons are in the picture. Now, what does that mean? These imams have the right to show this blasphemy to anyone, and did, and they added 3 cartoons of their own, one of which showed the prophet as a pig, which, as you know, is an incitement in itself. The words in the paper. They can do it, and we can't even see what they're talking about. Well, do you understand the significance of this? The media is much too dominated, for my taste, by images. Everything is image now. Even the New York Times is mainly pictures. Here, the whole story is about an image, and no one is allowed to make up their minds by seeing it themselves. We're shielded from it by our editors in a free press and a free country who are paralyzed with fear and paralyzed with the idea that anyone might be hurt.
All right,
this is disgraceful.
Let's take on a case where they did take an action. Earlier this year, David Irving was sent to prison for 3 years for being in Austria and being accused of being he confessed to being a Holocaust denier. I'm sorry.
No, he denied being
he denied being a Holocaust denier, having brought a libel case 6 years earlier against an American professor who said he was, but having 16 years previous to that denied that there were gas chambers at Auschwitz. This is a very eccentric, bizarre, self-obsessed historian who claimed the right to say what he believed, regardless of the amount of offence it was given, and he was denied that freedom to offend. 3 years in jail, is that right, Christopher? Do you think that's fair?
They're appealing to make it 10.
Yeah. So, good?
3 years from now.
Is that good?
It's a scandal. It's a scandal in itself. And as it happens by its timing, because it almost the same week as the Danish controversy, it allowed Muslim demagogues to say, you see, the West doesn't really believe in free speech.
That's right.
And I would take that as a criticism of Western governments, not of myself, because I defend Irving too, and for several years have been doing so. Not just for his right to do this as a matter of free speech, but actually as a matter of free inquiry.
There's been this whole debate in Canada about a law that would have criminalized denial of the so-called Armenian genocide. You know, and the Turks made a huge fuss about this, saying that there was no genocide and you can't criminalize its denial. And this went back and forth, and I gather the law has now been withdrawn from consideration. But the question is, how many things can you criminalize imagining or arguing or inquiring into? It starts off with one and goes on to the other. Again, deep offense is caused by arguing that there was no Holocaust. And I think if you stand up and argue there wasn't one, you will suffer generally before the tribunal of public opinion. But to be thrown into jail for it is certainly a bit difficult.